Hello and welcome everyone to Childcare Aware of Minnesota's April 2023 TEL Talk. Today we are being joined by a special guest, Kassie Infante from HomePlace Collective of Development of Education for a conversation about models for education justice and youth activism, truly defining the practices, skills, and mindsets needed to build critical socio-political literacy in early childhood context. Before I pass the baton on to Kassie, I'd like to once again welcome you to TEL Talk. I'm trying to get my slide here to advance. TEL Talks are monthly webinars for early childhood program leaders to facilitate solution-focused discussions around varying topics in the early childhood field in Minnesota. These one-hour webinars do not meet the standards for a formal professional development training event, and participants will not receive a certificate of completion. However, TEL Talks are designed as community building opportunities for early childhood leaders to engage and share ideas surrounding specific topics. Childcare Aware of Minnesota supports the professional growth of early childhood educators with professional development opportunities, including classroom trainings, eager to learn online training opportunities, and professional development advising services. We also support programs in Minnesota's quality rating and improvement system through Parent Aware. Our office administers grants and scholarships such as the regional grant, retain bonus, teach scholarships, CDA awards, and the Foreign Credential Evaluation Scholarship. We also have 2 building supports, Childcare Aware Finder and Empower to Educate. To contact someone in any of these departments, please visit our website at www.childcareawaremin.org/contact us. So with that information, I'd like to welcome Kassie. Thank you for giving us your time and sharing your expertise around today's topic. I will stop my share so that you can upload yours. Thank you, Kassie, for being with us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erica. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so thrilled to join you today. I really appreciate you welcoming me into this space. I definitely have some slides to share. My name is Kassie Infante. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-founder of HomePlace Collective. We are a group that basically works with educators and youth development nonprofits to really activate what we call socio-political literacy, all in the name of activism, civics, and social change. So I'm really passionate about education justice, and I'm excited to dig into this. I think also because we are a small group, which is really exciting, I'd love for this to be participatory. There are a few prompts throughout my presentation, and I'd also just like to know who's in the space. And so if you feel comfortable adding to the chat, just introducing yourself, your name, what brings you here, whether it's a role or a specific thing that you're interested in learning more about related to civics and activism and all of that. So if you're comfortable, I'd love to meet you in the chat. So if you give me one moment, I'll share my screen. Oh, and it does say I need permission for screen sharing. Perfect.
You should have that now, Kassie. Thank you, and I apologize for that.
Awesome. No worries at all. It happens to me all the time too. Okay, perfect. Let's see here. Perfect. And can folks see my slides? Awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. So we are here to talk about how do we raise the next generation of democratic citizens, and what does it mean to have socio-political literacy? Before we get into that, I do just want to introduce myself a little bit more broadly so you know sort of my positionality and what I bring to the space. I'm based in Massachusetts. I'm an activist, community organizer, and a former elected school board member. This is myself and my partner, Marianela. We run HomePlace Collective together. We As I mentioned, we've been approved by the Department of Education to help schools, community spaces, nonprofits really build civic skills and take that in action out in communities. We do that by providing trainings, workshops, and speaking engagements such as this one. And we do that because we are deeply committed to education justice. And we know that activism and civic participation is a means by which we can reach education justice. We've both worked in education for around 13 years, and we have noticed the inequities that are so deeply embedded across our schools, particularly between private schools and public schools and charter schools, seeing all of the differences. And we notice that students, teachers, families are truly begin to internalize the inequities. You know, they sort of start to see it as their own shortcomings, and they're rarely given the opportunity to solve or work on these said issues. And so, you know, we deeply believe in the power of civics and policy change and activism. And so, for example, we have led funding campaigns in Massachusetts, most notably the Student Opportunity Act that brought an extra $3 million to our Lawrence Public School districts here in the state. And we did that in partnership with middle school and high school students. So we ran a campaign where we met with legislators, we door knocked, and different activities. And so this is just a snapshot of who we are and what drives me to do this work. And so our goals for today is that we really want to talk about what does civics learning look like, and how do we build socio-political literacy, particularly within the early childhood context, and how does that relate to education justice? And we're going to talk a little bit more about what education justice means. And then we're going to talk about how do we translate all of our learning around activism as a tangible skill. How do we turn that into exploration of activism opportunities for students in a variety of educational environments? So thinking about, and I just want to look at the chat to see where folks are coming from. Oh, perfect. Okay. Admin, development specialist. Awesome. So coming from all types of different spaces, thank you for adding that to the chat. And so really thinking about how do we apply this? I want to start off by sharing some community agreements for our hour together. You might be familiar with this practice, but community guidelines are a really great way to set expectations for groups and participation during meetings. They can really help to make sure that everyone in a space has a positive and constructive experience. They do also work great as a classroom management technique and as a way to really build consensus and community with students. So I always highly recommend that when you're in a group learning environment of all kinds, community guidelines or agreements are a great sort of way to begin to build trust. And so I wanted to sort of model that today. And so these are the ones that we often use. We want to have fun. We don't want anyone to sort of judge themselves for any questions. There are no wrong questions. We like to take space and leave space just to really make sure that we're including everyone who would like to share. We also, this one is really important. What's shared here stays here, but what's learned here leaves here. And so making sure that as we talk, I think particularly about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, justice, belonging, oftentimes personal stories come up, and we always want to make sure that this is a safe and brave space where those things can share. And finally, we often talk about being hard on issues, but soft on people. And if we ever need to think about, for example, if we're talking about a policy issue and we want to critique it, we often talk about roles and positions of power. So instead of necessarily critiquing a person and their specific persons, we are talking about their position of power and the power that they hold for change. And so I think that's a really powerful one. in sort of a harm reduction strategy and really thinking about education justice at the systemic level. And that's been a really fruitful guideline for us. And so I wanted to start off with my first sort of prompt. I would love to hear from folks in the space out loud if you feel comfortable, or in the chat. But I'd love to hear what comes to mind when you see these these terms. So activism and education justice. It can be phrases, it can be actions, words, maybe specific people, activists that you might think of. What comes to mind for you? And we're going to revisit this at the very end of our time.
I would say to me, education justice, and I'm not familiar with this term, what would probably be about trying to address, injustices or racism, other inequities that are happening in kind of the current school or education model.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Brianne. So naming like the system of power or oppression or specific structure of racism is absolutely relevant to education justice, or at least from my frame of reference. So I agree. Thank you for sharing that. What are some other thoughts folks have? Policymakers, exactly. Thinking of policymakers, so maybe at the state level, state representatives, senators, or at the local level, school board members, school committee members. Thinking of terms like social justice, decreasing inequities, challenging systems. Thank you, Christy and Jessica. Absolutely. Those are relevant. And if you continue to think of things, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to move us along here and we'll have some more time to talk about that. Oh, and then Erica says how race and ethnicity affects outcomes. Absolutely. Absolutely, that's relevant. And that certainly matches sort of my frame of reference as well. So next, I want to share a little bit more information by what I mean when I say critical socio-political literacy. What is it and why is it important? And I think this image has been really instrumental in many of the work, much of the work that we do with educators and adults that serve youth, in helping them to understand and develop a shared language around a lot of the DEI terminology and jargon that gets used today. And I wanted to just kind of share this as a basis for our conversation. And so the first one you'll notice is you'll notice these are a group of people watching a soccer game. And the first image is a reference to equality, the first one on the left. So equality is the assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports, right? And so this is really seen as equal treatment. You can see that all of the people are trying to watch the game, but you might see that there's one person who can't quite see the game yet, right? And they all have the same support, which is this wooden crate. And then if we think about equity is actually more talking about that everyone gets the support they need, right? And so you'll notice the third person from the left has been given a second crate, right? And so now they can see the soccer game. And so this is the concept that people have different needs, and that when our various needs are met, this is getting us closer to equity. And this illustration uses affirmative action as an example of a policy that its aim is to produce equity, right? And so allowing or putting policies in place to help historically excluded groups of people, for example, go to college or be admitted into a university, is an example of equity. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to the last image, which is how this illustration is conceptualizing justice and how we think about it. And I think how many of you referenced just now in your sharing, and that's that all three people can see the game without supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed. The systemic barrier has been removed. And so, of course, you can see there's still a fence there, but, and so we could certainly talk about that more in depth. But I think it's really important to highlight that when we talk about justice, we are talking about systemic change. And often we see that happening at the policy level. I used the example earlier in getting more funding for our schools. That is a systemic example of how schools are supported or not. And I think that's a great sort of example when we think about fair and adequate funding across school districts and their needs. And I thought that this is just a really kind of helpful illustration to think of these different ways or think of these different concepts. I want to say that in sort of the early childhood context, young children are really learning the foundations of these first two blocks, right? Equality and equity. As they get older, they'll move towards a more systemic approach of understanding justice. But typically, from our experience and what I've seen, young children are really thinking about more of the social emotional learning aspects of building relationships with others when it comes to fairness. And if they are thinking about systems, they might think about the most salient, their school and their home. And I want to just add that a really important part of socio-political literacy is that as the adults that are serving young people, we have to do the educational work of learning these things, because that is how we will transfer it to our young people. And justice, the concept of justice is really hard because in many ways we haven't seen it, right? Our entire socio-cultural fabric was built on systems of oppression that have ramifications today, right? We talked about racism, and people are actively being marginalized, disenfranchised, and disempowered. And in many ways, the system continues to perpetuate those inequities. And so often it's hard to envision justice because in many ways we haven't seen it, right? But I hope that this illustration was helpful for you in your understanding. And if you have any questions or thoughts on this, please put them in the chat. And we'll have some more time for discussion in a minute. But, oops, one second. Okay, so what skills do young people need to conceptualize education justice? And so when we think about youth development work, there's often a tension between what we refer to as navigational capital versus transformational capital. Navigational capital means that we are preparing young people to navigate the world the way it is, while transformational capital means we're preparing young people to transform the world into what it can be, right? And so we often, an example of this with navigational capital is, college prep programs, workforce development. Navigational capital is, to be clear, absolutely necessary and needed, but it's also in some ways insufficient for equipping young people to progress in a society that is inherently unequal, or in systems that are inherently unequal or unjust. And so we really want to try to think about, how do we start asking young people to think about, what does transformation look like? What does another world look like? And how do we do that through policy change or activism? How do we harness the power that we do have, whether it's in smaller or bigger ways, to create change? And I think another thing to mention about navigational capital is that it over focuses on the individual, right? So it really over focuses on what can the individual do for themselves versus thinking about systemic change. And again, not a bad thing, it's absolutely necessary. We need college readiness programs, but thinking about, how do we get closer to activism and thinking about systems? And I say this because before we even get to activism, we have to be able to see the systems. We have to be able to see what is it that needs to be changed? What is at the root cause of this specific problem? And I would say the way that this shows up in the early childhood context is that students are beginning to ask those questions. Young people are asking questions. Why are things the way that they are? I think most of you probably know you get a ton of questions from anyone under the age of maybe 8. And often the most important thing we can do as adults is nurture that curiosity and listen and affirm their innate curiosity. It's okay not to have all the answers, but really using that curiosity for powerful learning opportunities. And so I'm going to move us along here. We're going to think more about examples. When we think about what does building this socio-political literacy, this transformational capital, what does it look like in the early childhood context? I want to just remind us that what the research suggests is that by 5 years old, young people are already beginning to associate racial and gender characteristics with stereotypes, and they're already starting to internalize messages about race, gender, and they've inferred that from the adults and people around them. They infer that from media. And so I think it's important to name that oftentimes we don't always feel ready as adults to have these conversations, or we don't necessarily think young people are ready. But I think the reality is young people are already sort of having, are already in many ways conscious about issues of injustice. They just don't have the vocabulary yet. And I think it's really important to name that, because we always have to start before we feel ready. And so we like to think of at the early childhood stage, using your social emotional learning techniques is really important. And I think it's a great foundation for socio-political literacy. And so what does that mean? It means often that we are engendering a spirit of empathy and belonging in our classrooms or any spaces that we have young people in, not only for themselves, but for those around them. And you probably have some experience with that. I think what helps from the socio-political perspective is to really think about harnessing unpleasant emotions into opportunities for action. And so that doesn't always come through in sort of standard SEL practices, but thinking about asking a young person who might be upset or frustrated about something, a simple question of, well, how might we change this situation? What are the circumstances around the situation that you might want to change or that we could do something about, instead of pathologizing or thinking specifically about the behavior. And so another, thinking about systems and school engagement, it's really important to model discourse over debate. And so empathizing, understanding, and compassion, and building relationships. And again, going back to really nurturing curiosity, one student's sort of question or inquiry can really launch a full-on investigation into a topic within any specific space. And when students learn to take responsibility for their actions or for how they're contributing to a classroom space, they're really acting as mini change makers. They're already acting as activists, really supporting a culture of care and advocacy. One other thing I'll say is that often sort of earlier conversations around consent for self and others are actually a great proxy to think about power and the power that we have and responsibility for ourselves and others. And so I think thinking about power is at the root of educational justice, systems of power. And I think making sort of that approximation can be really helpful. A few other ideas here, making sure that you're diversifying your literary canon and your choices is really important for offering windows and mirrors. windows into other worlds and mirrors into affirming a student's identity, whether that's their racial, ethnic, or gender identity or more, their cultural heritage. These are ways to really broaden the intellectual development around socio-political topics, and using literature is a great vehicle to do that, right? So having like read-alongs, I know that's, of course, something that happens in the classroom all the time. And then offering public speaking or creative arts opportunities are really important, and really, I would say, fun ways to engage young people in really practicing that literacy. Finally, I want to just share, some examples of what does this look like, particularly from the early childhood example. So this can often, for this age group, turn into, as I mentioned, creating and sharing activist art, poetry, murals, volunteering with organizations. So oftentimes in my community, young people are leading community park cleanups and things like that. And then when they get a little bit older, forming student clubs, hosting forums and educational conversations around the issues. And then finally, I think this is sort of the more traditional activism that people think about, is participating in rallies, marches, and protests with, of course, the support of an adult. And I want to share 2 examples of this. And so on the left, you'll see this is a 2nd grade class that was shopping for Halloween costumes on partycity.com. And a few of the students were upset at the depiction of specific costumes that they felt were derogatory racial stereotypes. In particular, they were talking about a prisoner costume that they saw, and they felt really upset about that. They didn't understand, why is it that, why is that a costume? Why is it that someone gets to dress up as that in sort of jest? And so they actually wrote to Party City corporate and got the costume taken down. And so this was an example that they actually wrote. They wrote the letter with the help of their teacher, and their teacher sent it. And that's them reading the response. And then another example I wanted to actually share is a video. I think we do have time. If I can, I would have to reshare my audio. So give me just one moment here. Okay, I think I've pressed share audio, and so it might be a little bit loud. You might need to lower the volume on your computer. Apologize in advance if it's loud. But this is I thought this was a really inspiring example of a very young person who is an activist.
Here, I'm predicting. Listen to this guy right here. I'm predicting 2025. He'll be the mayor of Chicago, from the south side of Chicago, from Marcus Garvey Elementary School. Say hello for Sean Johnson.
Okay, I know it might have been a little bit hard to hear everything or make out everything he was saying, but I think you might get the gist. This was in response to the city of Chicago closing his public school, or attempting to. They actually reversed the decision, the school board did. And so I'd love to just hear, reactions, or, ask a question of, what do you think this 9-year-old, what kind of support do you think he had, or what skills do you see him really leaning on within this example?
I think that he exhibits a lot of bravery being able to public speak at that level. And he's clearly had a lot of good models for public speaking and supports to give him the confidence to be able to do that.
Definitely. I think I added the wrong or a different clip in here, because one of the initial clips I wanted to add was a journalist interviewing him. And in this interview, Ashan actually says, this is the young man's name, he says, "Oh, they asked my mom to speak, but she didn't want to. She was scared." So I think you're absolutely right, Jessica. I think, I think young people have a sort of fearlessness and bravery that kind of sometimes frightens us. And to see it so unfiltered in this moment, I thought was really beautiful. Another thing I noticed was he actually quoted MLK, which I thought was really powerful. And we often think about what are some ways to build like writing and public speaking skills, and tying in sort of like historical context and figures. I think that's a powerful learning opportunity. And so he had to have had, right, examples of models of activists, either in the classroom and also in his real life. So I just love like panning out and seeing the chair that he's standing on. I think that's awesome. I wanted to share also, let me see if I can put this in the chat. There's another great example. I wanted to just give you all a bunch of examples to really reference and be inspired by, from the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center. And this story that's in this article is really rich with examples and anecdotes from the educators in the space, as well as the young people. But basically, they participated in a community cleanup day and then learned about climate activists throughout history, and then wrote out different activist signs and did a little bit of like a mini demonstration. And so I think it's just a really great example. So I put that in the chat. And I'll continue us along here.
Listen to this guy right here.
So what are some other examples? So I wanted to just share that activism is any single action that someone takes to change the material conditions around them, right? And they might often do that. They might do that alone, or they might organize with other people and engage in collective activism and action. And so I think that having conversations at home about either current events or using media and literature, I think the global Black Lives Matter movement is a really great example of something to talk about with the young people in your life, around asking them, how and why are these people taking action? What do you think that might lead to? And having those really curious conversations is really important. And from the classroom perspective, we talked a little bit about incorporating or thinking about the socio-political in your SEL practices, but you can also think about doing that in any place-based activities, and also having group activities that really center on equity and cooperation and fairness. And then finally, again, really making sure that you're choosing diverse, culturally relevant literary choices that challenge stereotypes, right? That challenge these systems of power we've talked about. and thinking about that in your lesson planning materials as well, which I have a lot of resources for you at the end of today. And then finally, in community, I actually added this photo. This is my 6-year-old cousin, Nathan, at a community event hosted by an advocacy nonprofit in the city of Lawrence. And the charge was to create sort of a mural or art of what you want your community to look like. I think he ended up, I don't know that he fully understood the assignment, but he made like a little like hand butterfly mural, which was really sweet. But I think even these small moments that we might not necessarily see as activism is developing this literacy in young children that, first of all, being involved in your community with others is important and will lead to activism. And so these are the examples that I wanted to talk about, but I also wanted to open the space and hear from all of you. Are there any other examples, whether they're similar or not, that you've seen in your own context? Maybe not even, it doesn't have to be in the classroom or community or home. It could be anywhere, maybe in your personal life. I'll just open the space. No worries. I know we're all educators by nature and we're okay with silence. So it is totally fine. I think I actually have another slide with even more action ideas. And I think we've talked about most of them. But thinking about one of the things that we talked a little bit about in the Ashan example is, how do we share more examples of how history portrays activism and how activism has worked and yielded change, but also hasn't worked in some ways, right? So if we think about the civil rights movement is sort of the most like popular example that students will start to learn about. Thinking about, what types of actions did groups of people, whether it was maybe MLK or others, take part in, and what exactly happened after that? And just having really nuanced conversations about that can help tell the story that activism has shaped the systems around us, right, towards justice, but that the work is still undone in many ways. And so I think that's a really positive example that seemed to come through in Ashan's perspective. So finally, I can't believe I'm ending so early, but I have one final prompt for us to think about and discuss. But I'd love to just hear, has your definition of activism or education justice shifted at all since we started our conversation? And what might be something that you can implement in your role, whatever that role may be? Maybe it's even at home with the young people in your life, whatever is most salient for you in the moment. What is something that you can implement or, by the end of the year or maybe even next year? But I will give everyone time to just sort of process that, and we'll just have a whole group share out.
I can jump in. So I guess I'm thinking about two different kind of strains to this question. So I really did kind of appreciate all your examples of how seamless it could be to incorporate some of these strategies, thinking about public speaking or connecting with a community who you might not, just naturally interact with in your neighborhood or your school or your program, but kind of, intentionally seeking out those, opportunities to engage with people who are different than you, learn about different things. So I really appreciated that. And just kind of in my, personal life and my current role, definitely can see lots of avenues to kind of incorporate those strategies.
But then I'm also thinking kind of like across the country right now, how big of a push there is to really stifle conversations about, certain parts of our history. Some of the things we talked about today, I have friends who teach in certain states where I know they absolutely feel like these topics are off limits in their classroom. And thinking to just kind of big picture how to support educators in those environments and those students who, might be going to school in a place where this kind of thinking or, participation in kind of society or democracy might be, intentionally stifled by certain groups.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brianne, for bringing that up. It is really acute and I think a painful time in education. And it's something we talk often about, even with sort of parents who are also concerned and who are actively organizing against and really defending like truth telling, history, activism. There's so much work that lays ahead. And I think if we can turn that into a cause of hope, a cause that, activism is effective. It has been effective historically. And so if we can collectively coalesce and organize against these types of injustices, because they are injustices, then there's hope that we can be together and create change and stop some of these things from happening. So thank you for mentioning that.
Something that I would like to add, going back to Ashan and listening to part of his speech, his passion that he had to stand up and to be heard, to not just for his voice, but for the others in his school, really made me get emotional, really proud. And I don't know him, but I want to know him. But I think it really embodies what we want to teach educators, as well as students alike, to be an activist, and to support each other in the process. So to be as brave as Ashan was takes a lot of skill, and he obviously has a lot of people in his life that have been supportive and have showed passion and have poured that out to him for him to be able to stand up. And so for me, it just, maybe it's my mom nerves, but it made me really emotional and proud, and I just wanted to give him a big squeeze.
Absolutely, Erica. Thank you for sharing that. I'm getting emotional reading everything in the chat too. That's beautiful, Jessica and Christy. I hope you're able to make it. I think that's something we didn't really I didn't touch on a lot, but I think modeling this is really important. Even going to your school board meeting and speaking about something for less than 5 minutes is really impactful. Talking about any sort of DEI initiatives and showing that this is not that these are rooted in justice and belonging for all of our students, and that it's entirely necessary to support. So I think that was kind of my segue into activism, was through local politics and school board. I think often we think about sort of the larger systems and structures, but even, Christy, the DEI Center, Jessica, your classroom, those are microcosms of systems that we have the power to impact.
I also felt emotional from seeing that video, and then something you had said about seeing how asking children what they think. We're always kind of trying to come up with ideas and all that kind of stuff, but just seeing what kids think, what their perspective is, and just hearing them out a bit and encouraging that. That's what I am taking away from this.
Thank you. Absolutely. It's hard because we want to just give them all the things and information, and we sometimes forget that there's already information there and already rich experiences and knowledge about how they're experiencing the world. So definitely drawing that out is important and can be hard. Sometimes we want to be reactionary, or we're worried. I know many of you might have had a moment where you're like, did you just say that? You're a little bit, worried, but I think knowing that they haven't quite yet grasped the full sort of injustice nature of the world and the words and the weight of the words, just using them as sort of learning opportunities is so powerful, and as early on as we can. Awesome. Any final reflections here before I close by sharing some more resources?
Kassie, I just wanted to chime in and say that this topic that you've presented today, and I know several people that are on the call today are part of our child care aware system, and they know the work that we're doing in DEI and the work that is happening with our state QRIS. And I just wonder, you know, and I thank you for what you've presented here and what you've given us to think about in terms of us having something to kind of noodle on and chew on and think about how we apply it to, you know, our work as a quality coach or our work as a professional development or workforce advisor, and how we're helping the people who help the young children navigate these waters, know that they don't have to know all the answers at the moment, that they can wonder together, and it's okay to swim together in that, and just kind of have in the back of their head the end goal of this is where we all want to get to, you know, fair and equitable education for everybody. And I just think it's so powerful for you to come and talk to us, especially at this time where we're launching into some initiatives here in Minnesota, and it's a really exciting time. And also any little bits of information and support and resources that we can get that are being spread in different parts and arenas and sections of the world is great for us to have. So I just wanted to say thank you from myself in my role and on behalf of all of us.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor. This is my deepest passion to talk about and to be in community with other educators. And for me, educator is an encompassing term, whether you're in the classroom or not. But I really appreciate that. I know Child Care Aware is doing so much. I looked at your policy priorities, and I know that there's a deep commitment to advocacy as a means for DEIJ, and that's so important, right? Because it's often missing actually from a lot of educational spaces. So to even see that was inspiring for me. So I'm excited to just like bear witness and support all of the work that you all are doing. I want to just share one more resource and a way to stay in touch with me if you'd like. This resource is basically a collection of critical pedagogical tools and resources and organizations. When we think about criticality, all that really means is we're talking about getting to the root. We're talking about getting to justice. And so these organizations have been doing work around socio-political literacy for decades, and have incredible resources depending on your subject matter and what you're interested in looking for. I mean, everything from like lesson plan builders to discussion prompts to activities. I think there's like a policy tracker. So if you're thinking a little bit more about like the advocacy and activism piece, there's just so many rich resources here, many of which are free. So I wanted to share that sort of download for you. And then I would love for you to just stay in touch with us. We have, through HomePlace, we have a newsletter that we send. We send one newsletter a month. So I promise not to spam you. But if you're interested in staying in touch with us, please sign up for our newsletter. I just put our sign up in the chat. And yes, I, again, really appreciate the invitation to be here. And I hope we get to see each other soon, maybe, again.
That would be wonderful. Thank you again so much, Kassie. And what we do after each of these Tell Talk sessions is we send out a follow-up. So all these resources I've been collecting, we'll send it out to everybody that registered for the webinar today. If they weren't able to attend, we'll get them the information. But this is just great. We really appreciate your time and everything that you've shared with us, and would love to just stay in touch. And if there's another opportunity to bring you in and have you help us along, I think we would all appreciate it. So anybody else have any final thoughts or questions for Kassie? Great. Well, I wish you all a great day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Have a great day,
Have a great
everyone.
day, everyone.